In this lesson, I'm going to explain to you how to tie off your thread when you don't have enough thread to finish a line of smocking, how to tie it off and make it look nice or as nice as we can. Remember that the line that we started with is the back smocking piece. This is still the same line that I started there, so I'm going to be able to just work from this back piece. So you can see I have about an inch and a quarter or so here left, but I don't have enough thread to comfortably be able to finish that line. So all I'm going to do to tie off this thread is go under my last stitch. And it doesn't matter which direction you come from. I'm going to go under my last stitch, pull that through, and then I'm going to loop through the little circle that it makes and literally tie a knot. I'm going to do that twice. Going to go through the same circle again. The one thing that you have to pay really close attention to is do not get down under this guide thread. If you do that, you're going to tie that guide thread into your knot. So don't go that deep. Just make sure you go under that stitch, same stitch, and simply go through that little circle. It gets twisted up, but carefully put your needle through there and tie a knot. Then all you have to do is clip that thread off. You don't want it hanging very long. So there you have it, a little bitty knot at the back, and because this is the back of my piece of fabric, it'll stay back there and it will never be seen. So how do I get started again? Well, one of the things that I paid close attention to was the thread that I came up through was what we would call an up stitch. In other words, my thread was on the upper side of the needle. So I'm going to take my new thread, and I've just threaded another needle and tied a knot in the end. And I'm going to come in on that same pleat. Feels a little bulky, but I'm going to come in on that same pleat and kind of bury that knot down inside that little valley. And this stitch is going to be a down stitch. So I continue my pattern along. It doesn't make any difference. I haven't skipped anything. I had a down stitch, an up stitch, a down stitch. Now my thread's up. And I'm just going to continue until I get to the edge. Once you get to the edge, and yes, there will be times that your threads will get a little tangled. Once you get to the edge, you're going to do the same thing. You're going to come through this. You'll have come through this and created a stitch. You're going to slip your needle under there, make a knot, do that twice, clip it off, and you're finished. That way you should have one long line of stitching all the way across your sample. And even though we had to tie off and add a little bit of extra thread here, doesn't mean there's any problem there. We go to the end, we tie off, and we're finished. So when you turn this over, one of the things that I want you to notice, if you look really close, it's easy to see which line we've stitched on because my lighting is not really good here, but there's a very vague, faint indentation right here on line 4 that we stitched in. You don't see it on any of the other lines. It's just a very faint little indentation that you can see has been back smocked when you look at that entire piece of fabric. So it's easy to tell where we've been and where we're going to be going. So now I want to start on the first row on the top of the fabric. In other words, this will be the actual smocking that you're going to see. So I pick up my plate and I read over here in line 1, it says center the design. Okay, well, how in the world am I supposed to do that? So we start a base row at row 9. All right, this says with the blue thread, so I have got me a needle here already threaded with blue thread, 3 strands, just like I did the back smocking, 3 strands always when we're doing what we call geometric smocking. We're using 3 strands unless the plate calls for something different. So with the blue thread, I'm going to smock a 5-step trellis between rows 9 and 10. With blue, smock 2-step trellis between rows 9 and 8.5 to make trellis hearts. What does that even mean? All right, so if we come over here to this side, we're going to start on row 9, just like the instructions said. And because I know that we're starting here with, it says the base between rows 9 and 10, it says start with the base at row 9, that means this one right here, and smock a 5-step trellis between rows 9 and 10. Now look, here's the problem. This is going to mean, what they're telling me right here is to start over here with this particular little thread right here between the heart instead of at the center of the heart. Because I've done this several times before, I'm going to have you start in the middle of the heart. I like a heart to be my center instead of the center between 2 hearts to be the center of my design. And I hope that's not more confusing than it is helpful. But we're going to start and make a base stitch right here on row 9. So if I hold this up and I count from the top to row 9, I know I've got, do not count the holding thread at the top, that's your holding thread, but count the base rows, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. I know that I'm here on this row, and I'm going to follow it all the way to the center. And that's really the best way to find the center of your design. You just got to follow the row. So I know that my center on row 9 begins right here. So I'm going through the back and I'm going to pull my thread up to the left of the center on row 9 without catching that green gathering thread. All right, so I'm going to pull that to the front, and you can tell, hey, we've got a little bit of color on the front. Before I do anything else, I'm going to count up again by separating all of these threads, and I want to make sure, am I really on row 9? So I'm going to go up here to the very top again, that first gathering thread that I know is my smocking rows, not my holding rows, and I'm going to count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. I'm there. So I can smooth everything back out again. Get all my rows smoothed out really well. And because I know I'm 1 pleat to the left of center, I have a center pleat right here. Excuse me. Now I'm going to follow the instructions a little bit out of order. So I'm going to go to the right of that pleat that I came in on, and I'm going to create this very first base stitch. And over here, if you go back and see, it says smock a 5-step trellis. We're not doing that right now, between rows 9 and 10. And then smock a 2-step trellis between rows 9 and 8.5. That's what we're going to be doing first. So we're going to start here. That's our base. So we're straight across. Now, I'm going to eyeball what is halfway between row 9 and row 8. Well, it's about right there. I want to take 2 steps to get there. A 2-step trellis. Think of it as zigzagging, if you will. You're going to zig and you're going to zag. But this time, we're going to step up. So I'm going to go 1/4 of the way up and pull my thread through. Then I'm going to the next pleat, and see where I'm putting my thread through there? It looks like I'm about halfway between rows 8.5 and row 9. So I'm going to pull my stitch up there. Then when I get to the top of this, and while this doesn't tell you about another complete base stitch, what I know from seeing the design here is that I've got my 1, 2 stitches, and then I stitch straight across again, correct? So I'm going to do that and stitch straight across, same place, and I know that my thread has to go on top. How do I know that? Because now I'm going to be coming down to make my stitch. I'm going to be coming down. So I want my thread at the top here, and I call these little caps. They're like caps, literally. And I'm going to do a 2-step process to get back down to row 9. There's about a quarter, and then I'm back on row 9. And literally I've made a peak with a cap on it. I'm going to go straight across with my thread below, because now I want to go back up again. Whether my thread is on top or on the bottom depends on which direction I'm going. This particular row right here is simply a row of peaks and valleys. I'm going up and down, up and down, up and down, and I'm going to continue that across the entire row. Let's repeat one more. There is my base stitch. Then I want 2 stitches to bring me halfway between row 8.5 and row 9. So I'm going to go up about a quarter of a space between row 8 and 9. There's about a quarter. And then I'm going to go to the next pleat, and I'll be right at halfway to the next stitch. And then I'm going to put a cap on it. So straight across here, just like I do on the base stitch, and I have another peak. Now I'm going to step back down. Same thing, and I'm going to end up right here on the, on the gathering row. And see, my thread is below, so I'm going to make a base stitch again. This stitch will be significant because it's what I'm going to attach the bottom piece of my heart to. If you take a really close look here, again, what you're going to see is up, down, up, down. We're going to go up, down, and I'm going to do a few of these right here because I'm going to go ahead and demonstrate in this quick little video how to make the bottom half of the heart so that it really does look like a heart. Again, I'm taking 1, 2 steps. I'm going to put a cap on it by stitching straight across. I'm going to take 1, 2 steps to get back down to row 9. I'm going to stitch parallel straight across for my base. And literally, you're going to be doing that over and over and over again. So let's pretend that we have completed this entire row. How do we fill in from the center over to make sure that we have an entire row? We can't start all the way over here at the edge because we don't know if it will match when we get back over here to the center. So the easiest thing to do is to turn your fabric piece upside down. Take another needle. Now keep in mind, we're pretending we've got this entire row finished, so we don't need to worry about this. Then I'm going to turn my fabric piece upside down, and I'm going to come in from the back. It's really hard to do this in front of a camera for me. I need a camera that actually hangs from the ceiling. And I'm going to come in the center of that, what was my base stitch. And I'm going to pull my thread all the way through. Now, you're continuing to do the same thing over and over again, except you're doing it backwards. Now we're going to come down a quarter of a row, and then I'll be at the halfway point. See where I'm at now? And I'm going to put a base stitch here. When we turn it this way, I would have called that my cap. But because it's turned this way, now I'm just pretending that I'm doing the same thing, but I'm really stitching upside down. You're going to come back down. To row 10 with 2 stitches, and then stitch straight across. Now we're on row 10. We're going to come back up again, which sounds very backwards because it looks like we're going down. But remember, we've turned our fabric upside down. So we're actually working our way up here, but turned upside down, it looks down. I don't want you to get confused by this. You are literally just smocking upside down. Now, one of the things that you need to pay really close attention to right here is the tension on these stitches. You notice that I'm not making my stitches really tight, and let me explain to you what that looks like when you do your stitches really, really tight. I'm going to smock a couple of stitches here, or take a couple of stitches, and I'm going to do them very tight so you can see what that actually looks like. So let's say I pull this one really tight. And then I'm going to do the same thing with the next two. I'm going to pull it really tight. Because after all, we don't want those stitches to escape anywhere. And I'm going to do the same thing with the next one and pull it really tight. And the next one and pull it really tight. And I'll do just a few, enough so that you can see how different that it will look. Probably to an experienced smocker, it's going to look a whole lot more different than it would to those of you who have just now done this for the first time. But take a look at these stitches here and how tight this looks versus the way this thread simply lays on the fabric. You can feel it from behind. It bunches up much tighter. And you can see it from the front. If you continue to do it, a lot more white shows between the stitches than if you just lay the stitches on top of the fabric as you pull them through. Now, too loose, and those threads eventually will pull out and just kind of flop a little bit. You want the tension on your piece to be just tight enough to make your design look like it's just laying on top of your fabric. I'm going back in with my needle now to loosen this because I've gotten it tight enough that, like I said, it's kind of bunching my fabric up. And it not only looks bad, but it feels bad. It feels like it's got a big wad of something sticking out in the back. So I've loosened it up just enough. Maybe a little bit too loose up here, so I'm going to tighten it back up again just by pulling the thread a little bit with my needle. That's all part of what making the sampler is about. You just need to be able to push it through and let that fabric lay on top of let the thread lay on top of your piece of fabric. I'm sorry, when I make videos really late like this, I began to wonder what it is I'm saying after a while. Now, before we stop here, I'm going to do one more thing and show you what the bottom of the heart will look like. So we're pretending, now we're going to turn our fabric right side up, and we're pretending that I've got an entire blue row from there all the way to the other side, right? All right, so what does that mean for me in terms of, all right, these are supposed to look like hearts. How do I make that happen? The pieces that we've done here in two-step are the top part of the heart. Now, based on what your Smocking Plate said that I already read to you. We're going to go back and pick up the first part of this. Starting at the base row on 9 with blue, smock a 5-step trellis between rows 9 and 10. All right. Again, you've got to start in the middle with something like this because I want my heart to be centered in the middle. If I start all the way over here on the side, pretending that my blue is going all the way over here right now, I don't know what will end up right here in the middle. But I do know that according to this, I'll try to pull this apart a little bit so you can see better, that according to this, the center of my heart should be right here, because this is the center of my fabric. Even though it looks like it's a stitch or so off, this will be my first heart. Because of that, I'm going to go down here to row 10, and I'm going to stitch the bottom stitch of the heart, just like I did for the trellis above. I'm going to make my base stitch first, and my base stitch should perfectly align with this base stitch here to make the bottom of my heart. So I'm going to take a stitch straight across, just like I did at the top. But now I'm going to trellis up 5. That 5 should bring me to this next base stitch right here. And you know what? This is really interesting because I've made a mistake that you all probably could have very easily caught if you had just a little bit more experience, and some of you may have caught it already. But I just noticed this. I'm going to pull it apart really good so you can see. I was supposed to make a base stitch and then trellis up 2. Look what I've done here. I've made my base stitch here. I've trellised 1, 2, 3 to get to the top. Can't do that because I'll guarantee you when I get over here somewhere, the bottom of my heart here will not match my heart up here. So that's what we call in sewing, as all of you know, we got to take it out, start all over again. It's the easiest thing to do with the back of your needle. I take my thread out and use the eye end of my needle because it's not sticky and it won't catch the fabric. And I very gently pull on these threads. Now, had I gotten all the way to the edge over here and hadn't found that mistake until then I would be really upset with myself, because that simply means I've got to go back and take out every stitch all the way across until I get to that one mistake. So this one I don't feel too bad about. It was easily caught, and I've caught it in plenty of time, so I had to take out a few stitches, yes. I have to rethread my needle, and I just have to start that part all over again, provided I can get my needle rethreaded. All right, so I'm going to forget this at the bottom for a second. So there are times when you're smocking, especially when you're picture smocking, you may have 6 or 7 needles all threaded and in your piece of fabric all at one time. So I'm going to go back up here. It's a great relearning experience for us because remember, we're going to take 2 stitches to get to the center. Here's 1 between rows 8.5 and 9. There's 1, and I'm going to pull it a little snug there. And I'm halfway through. Between rows 8.5 and 9, I'm right at row 8.5. So there's the second one, and here's the cap on it. Oops. I do know that I have my needle coming out the top, but because I'm going to go down again, I've got to get my needle coming out of the bottom. And now my threads are trying to tangle with one another, so I'm going to try to get this one way far out of the way, and the best way of doing that is simply running it through your fabric way over on the other side. Get it out of your way so you can function here. Now, I've corrected it. I've got 1, 2 steps and a cap. I'm going to come down. 1, 2, and a base, parallel with that green gathering thread. Let's go up a couple more because we're going to make hearts now, and I want you to be able to see how this really functions. I know that as I'm stitching here, it's really hard for you to see the green gathering thread. I can see it really well while I'm stitching. I don't know that the camera is picking it up quite as well, but I'm always looking between these threads as I'm doing this. That's your point of measurement. You may be asked to take a quarter of a stitch, a half of a stitch. You never know what a plate's going to have you do, but you need to be able to eyeball between these two stitches and divide that space evenly just by looking at it. All right, so I've taken a few more. I'm going to move my thread way over here. Now we're going to go back to the bottom. You won't be doing this because you're going to be finishing this all the way across, then turning around and coming backwards. So all you'll see is a row of up and down, up and down, up and down, all the way across before you start the bottom of your heart. I'm doing this for a simple explanation. We'll go over it again in the next video, I'm sure, so that you can see exactly what I've done when I actually complete the rows. So again, I've come in from the back side on the same pleat as this base stitch, and I've stitched parallel across row 10. Now I'm going to be making 5 steps to get me up here to this base stitch. All right. I am almost amazed sometimes that I even remember what it is I'm supposed to be doing, because it looks to me like I've made the same mistake all over again. And I have. Here's my base stitch. There's 1 stitch. There's 2 stitches. There's 3 stitches, and then my cap. Remember, I'm only supposed to have 2 stitches. And yet I've got 3. So, aside from getting really frustrated with yourself, which, you know, I'm getting there now, the only thing that you can do, now if I stitch an entire row and it's way back over here, I would take my scissors and simply go in and start clipping some stitches and taking it out. But this way, look, I've only made, what, 1, 2, 2.5 caps here. Eventually your thread will begin to get frayed, and you're not going to want to use the same thread over and over again. But I'm not that far along yet. It's going to cost me a little time, should cost me a lot of embarrassment and a little bit of frustration, but it doesn't. We make mistakes. I make mistakes. We just take them out. We start again. And if you've sewn at all, you know, it's a pretty easy mistake to make. And we spend, I promise, I've spent as much time taking out in my lifetime as I've ever spent stitching. Now, I want to make sure I don't take out too far, so I'm just looking as I'm going to make sure that I surely don't want to take out anything that's correct. Again, I'm using the eye part of my needle, just sliding it between the pleats and catching the thread. See how the top of this thread where I'm taking out, how it's really curly? That's because it's going over the pleats. All right, I took out the cap. Take out this thread. It looks like, I believe I'm trying to make a second cap when I stitch here. So I took out all 3 of those stitches. And now I'm back to my base stitch again. So I'm going to rethread my needle again. This time I'm going to trim that thread just a little bit. It's beginning to get frayed on the ends, so it's harder to thread the eye of the needle. And this time I'm going to be a whole lot more conscientious and count much more carefully when I put this stitch in. All right, I've got my base stitch. I just want 2. So I'm going to go up a quarter. My thread's getting a little bit frayed there, so I can't keep taking this out over and over again. And now I'm going to take my second stitch. Going to look at it closely. Yeah, I've got 1 and I've got 2 stitches, but look what I've done. For you, it might be okay, but for me, I'm a little bit picky. My second stitch comes up here to the halfway point, and it looks to me like it's a little bit long. See, it's already as high as this cap is, and that's only the second stitch. So my cap's going to look a little bit tall in my book. So I'm going to pull that stitch out just because I don't like the way it looks. And don't berate yourself too much. Like I said, I've been smocking since Benjamin was a baby. So, in fact, I began smocking when he was a baby. I didn't know anything about this when Rachel was a baby. So if you take those 33 years or so, I ought to know better than to make those kinds of mistakes. But I do. That should bring you some comfort. I still make them. All right, so I'm going to try again, and I'm shooting for about halfway between rows 8.5 and 9, which will put my cap at the same level as it is here. That looks a lot better, a lot closer. And I'm going straight across here with my thread on top. Ta-da! I think I finally got it right. So I'm going to come down 2 stitches. And I'm going to make my base at the bottom. And I'm going to repeat this again a couple of times. How many times have I done this now? 4, maybe 5. So I'm beginning to wear the thread and I'm beginning to wear the fabric. I've got to pay more attention and get it right. Another really, really common mistake that you're going to find yourself having made over and over again until you get a lot of practice is that instead of taking 1 pleat and stitching through 1 pleat, you'll find that you accidentally stitched through 2. And you won't know it until you're trying to match it up with something else. And then you'll go, oh my, I've got 2 pleats stitched together instead of 1. And yes, you'll go through and you'll take it out. And you'll start again. All right, I think we're just about back to where I stopped. Stitching 2 for this row, making my base stitch. Now I'm going to pin my thread up over here just to get it out of the way. And we're going to once again pretend I've gone all the way across this row. All right, now let me find the needle, the thread I found. There's the needle. And we really are going to make the base of this heart. All right, got my base stitch. Now I'm going to count up 5, and I want to do it as evenly as possible between row 10 and row 9. So just with my eyeball, I'm imagining how can I split this into 5 equal segments. I'm trying to go up 1/5 of the space between those 2 rows as I trellis. There's 1. Got a piece of white thread of some kind caught in that stitch. Just a stray piece of thread. There's 2. And there's no way to learn to do this except learn how to eyeball it. 3, 4, and get that 4th one in there. My 5th one should bring me perfectly in line with that base stitch, and it does. So I've trellised up 5. I'm going to put a cap on that matches exactly with the base stitch above it. There you can see I've got half of a heart because I started in the center. Now let's make a full heart. Now my thread is on the bottom, so we're going to stitch down 5, and when I get to the 5th stitch, it should be equal with this base stitch here, but on row 10. This one's on row 9. All right, so let's try it. I'm going to go, my thread should always be on top of my needle. It should follow my needle. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, and voila. When I get down here to row 10 and I stitch parallel across that gathering thread there, I am completing a base stitch that's perfectly aligned with the base stitch above it. Now, to complete the heart, I'm going to trellis back up to the next base stitch, 5 stitches, because that's what the instructions told me to do. 1, 2, 3, 4, and lo and behold, 5. And it's perfectly aligned with the base stitch on row 9. So I'm going to stitch across, and look, I have a heart. So what I know is, even though I only did half of it, this little heart is going to be centered on my entire piece of fabric. And when I get all the way across this row with both of these lines of stitching, I'll have a row of hearts here. I will turn it upside down to finish making the row of hearts out to the right. You always smock left to right. When you have to center a design, you have to use the center where you started as your left-hand row, as your left-hand guide, to then move you out all the way to the right. Now, the next time you see this, I will have all of these stitches completed, and we'll be able to look at it and say, aha, there's the center heart. Exactly like this center heart is designed in my plate here. Now, what I want you to be very conscientious of is these little pieces here are supposed to represent little tiny flowers. Those will be some of the very last things you'll do. I get really anxious sometimes, and I think to myself, I have to just do one. I just need to do one so I can see what it's going to look like. And there's nothing wrong with that. But typically the embellishments like that are the very last things you do. You complete all of these other rows first. So while this has been a little bit of an extended video because I made the mistake 4 or 5 times, that's really a good learning opportunity for those of you who are new to this, because it's nice to see that even people who have done this years and years and years and have a lot of experience make mistakes. We all do. And you just have to be patient with it. Take it out, try it again. Then we'll be going through some of these double stitched rows, which doesn't mean anything to you now, but it will pretty soon. It's really nice that at this point, as quickly as it seems, you're able to see something. You're able to see that you're smocking a design, even though all you did was smock a row of 2 and cap, 2 and base, 2 and cap, 2 and base. Do that all the way across, and then you base, trellis 5, base, trellis 5, base, trellis 5. It's the same thing. And you're even here, and you will always be even if you make sure to pay attention to the guide threads between the rows. Spacing is important. It may not always look perfect, but because you're conscientious of the amount of space between 2 rows, that's something that you learn to eyeball and you get used to very quickly.